Speculative fiction usually tries to do two things at once. It builds an imagined world and then uses that world to try to test a theory about our own. The genre entails an artful kind of extrapolation. It takes present trends, pressures, and contradictions and asks what they look like when you allow them to play out over time. At its best, the point isn't prediction for its own sake, the point is clarification. By changing the setting, specifically the time period in which the novel takes place, the genre makes the rules of the present easier to see. What we treat as natural, what we treat as inevitable, what kind of things get sidelined, what kind of institutions manage to keep reproducing themselves, even when the world is falling apart. That is the terrain What We Can Know by Ian McEwan wants to occupy. But it also operates in the realm of broader meta-narratives as well, particularly ones involving how we understand history. Really, the novel seeks to meditate, or perhaps ruminate, on the concept of history itself. What it is, what it's for, what it even means to learn from history when the record is incomplete, the evidence is scattered and lost, and distorted interpretations are inescapable. A useful way to think about the novel's project is cartography. Maps are never really neutral. A geopolitical map makes borders look like a fact of nature. A map of trade routes makes the world look like a giant circulatory system. An outdated map is an artifact of a prior geopolitical order. Maps tell you what the cartographer thinks matters. You can't look at a map without also seeing the priorities of the people who made it. And you can't use a map without inheriting its distortions. Maps don't just show you where things are, they train you to see things in a certain way. McEwan's book is fascinated with and simultaneously doomed by that very problem. The power of literature, and indeed all art, lies in its ability to problematize those parts of culture which totalize society through oppressive norms and false dichotomies. Art challenges these things by raising questions, not providing coherent answers. Yet the problem with any attempt to picture history is that the framework you use inevitably decides what becomes visible in the first place. The novel really does have a decent hook. History is really just a massive series of traces, durable artifacts, some half-legible documents, a lot of missing context, and we humans have a compulsive need to fill the gaps with our own imaginations. We really cannot help but to do so. People study history with the hope that such knowledge inoculates us against repeating our past mistakes. And yet, we continuously watch society repeat these patterns anyway. What We Can Know tries to live inside that contradiction and cash out its implications. What is the point of history when the record is incomplete? And all of the supposed lessons we're meant to learn from history just seem to be lost on key decision makers. It's as though we're in a chronic state of dementia, or as Frederick Jameson might put it, we've entered a time when the majority has lost the ability to think historically. It's a premise that promises quite a lot, but as we'll see, the delivery feels a bit dry at times, and ironically, the perspective offered sometimes veers into ahistorical territory, despite its ostensible dedication to this field of study. The book toggles between two major timelines. The main action occurs in 2119. In this dreary future, the planet has been mangled by climate catastrophe and geopolitical conflict. Thomas Metcalf, a humanities scholar, has become totally fixated on locating a lost poem from the early 21st century written by a highly regarded poet by the name of Francis Blundy. This unpublished work was recited once at a dinner party in 2014 and has since become this mythical piece of lost art. So the book switches between Thomas's academic sleuthing in the future and the 2014 backstory of this poet and his world, giving you a sort of dual narrative about how history is remembered or conversely misremembered and distorted due to the passage of time. The structure is clean and intelligible, and it naturally sets up the work's larger interrogation of memory, myth, and the way culture turns sparse evidence into cohesive narratives. The characters across these two eras function as mirrors, or at least rhyming figures. Tom is neurotic, introspective to a fault, and obsessive in a manner that seems at first like intellectual discipline, right up until it starts to look like a form of avoidance. Tom is a literary formalist at heart, he even admits it at some point in the book, trying to decode the work itself, which is really peculiar in this case because it's a piece of art he doesn't have access to. Blundy's poem is, for this novel, an absent cause in the Spinozist sense. It is the void from which the generative text is produced. The poem stands in for history itself. We can only come to know history through artifacts. So too can our narrator only come to know Blundy's epic poem through traces, namely correspondence, articles, etc. This turns the entire scholarly endeavor into a kind of intellectual ghost hunt. Rose Church, Thomas's colleague, lover, and eventual wife, exists as his pragmatic counterweight. She points out the obvious holes in his logic and keeps reminding him that his historical reconstructions are really just creative inventions of his own mind. In 2014, Francis Blundy is the world's foremost acclaimed poet, but we see very quickly that he's more of a narcissistic craftsman who treats his own work as the primary moral fact of the universe. He shares Thomas's obsessive quality, and so too does he share the collateral damage that comes with it. Francis neglects his wife Vivian and then produces a grand gesture to make up for it, an epic poem dedicated to her. The poem functions as apology, monument, self-justification, and brand management all at once. Vivian, from Thomas's distant perspective, initially appears as an enigma. She is an apparently dutiful partner orbiting this creative genius, but we don't really get a sense of her motivations solely from the archival documents and correspondence Thomas has access to. Part 2 of the book really complicates this. Vivian has her own interior life, her own motives, her own regrets, her own private judgments, and the book at the very least understands that the wife of the genius trope is a trap that can be sprung in any number of problematic directions. Taken together, these paired relationships across time sketch the novel's emotional machinery. In a way, Thomas and Francis are analogs, both men consumed by their obsessions and somewhat blind to what's going on in the moment as well as the real people around them. These men neurotically fixate on their chosen obsessions, one into the vanished poem and the other into his own mythos. Conversely, Rose and Vivian serve as the grounding forces who reveal that obsession with the past or with art needs to be balanced with attention to the present and the people who inhabit it. That's a great setup. It gives the book a humanistic framework for its larger thematic questions, and it also provides an opportunity for the novel to puncture its own pretensions when the characters start acting like the past is more real than the present. It's precisely this interplay of characters that really drives home the novel's themes, even if it sometimes gets a bit lost in its own reflections. The future backdrop is painted in broad strokes. Sea levels have risen enough that London is underwater, and the United Kingdom has become a kind of archipelago. The US has fractured into territories controlled by competing factions. The book uses its own terminology for the sequence of catastrophes. The derangement refers to the period of cascading climate and nuclear disasters, and the inundation names these massive flooding events that follow, tied in the novel to a limited nuclear strike. These two concepts, the derangement and the inundation respectively, define the backdrop of a world a century from now where society has been reshaped by these irreversible changes. And these are effective labels. They have the kind of ring of future shorthand, the way historical epochs get reduced to a single word. It's a pretty classic dystopian setup where the population has been cut down drastically by all these disasters, floods, limited nuclear conflicts, etc. The past decade has produced a small library of these climate change, speculative history type novels with varying results. Some are genuinely harrowing, some are cheap thrill rides, and some aim for a sad, contemplative mood where collapse is really just the backdrop for the author's personal reflections. There's nothing inherently wrong with that last approach, by the way. A catastrophe large enough to reorder the world would obviously reorder the human psyche, and that can serve as a poignant stand-in for things that are going on today. It's a powerful backdrop, and in theory, it's a great way for authors to explore how humanity might adapt or fail to adapt to these enormous challenges. But here's the rub, and this is something that really grates on me. A lot of these books end up feeling like they're treading the same water. They paint a grim picture of the future, but then get lost in their own world-building mythos or philosophical musings without really offering a fresh take or a compelling narrative drive. They're more interested in being moralistic cautionary tales than in telling a story that really grips you or makes you see the world in a new way. The problem, at least for readers who have spent the last few years watching reality get increasingly surreal in increasingly banal ways, is that the genre often ends up circling present-day anxieties rather than thinking through what a century of compounded shocks would actually do to social life. In other words, authors often fail to perform the creative extrapolation that is supposed to define this genre. The future becomes a stage where contemporary concerns are performatively expressed again and again, just with higher sea levels and fewer functioning institutions. So when I come across a book like this one, I can't help feel a bit of fatigue. It's like, yes, we get it. The future is a mess and history repeats itself, but what else do you have to say? Are we really just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic of dystopian lit, or is there something more meaningful and urgent that we're missing? That's the itch that a lot of these books just don't quite scratch for me. I admire what this book is trying to do. It's attempting to grapple with the significance of history, of thinking historically, of historicity itself. Is history worth studying? What is history? If we are left with only minor traces of some much more complex reality from the past, and the mind cannot help but to fill in the gaps with flowery details, what use is history really? The book's answer is certainly nuanced, but of course it leans towards a favorable view of the field. Namely, the book prizes history as a kind of navigational tool for the present. But the skeptic's view is useful too, because we do need to interrogate the significance of any given event. History is in flux, and in order to navigate such treacherous waters, it's fair to say we have to triangulate. In other words, we cannot help but to recontextualize events in order to make sense of them in our present moment. And there is always some level of distortion at play when we do that. So yes, I respect this literary project at some basic level, but it has so many eye-rolling moments for me. Perhaps it's more suitable for someone less black-pilled about climate change and other world events. What we can know is at its most convincing when it deals with small, specific human distortions. Obsession, projection, the hunger for coherence, the way people turn fragments into stories because they can't tolerate the void. It's less convincing when it gestures at the structure of society and then looks away before the gesture demands follow-through. The world of 2119 is described as shattered, but the daily mechanics of that shattering remain quite vague. The text wants the ambiance of collapse, and it wants the philosophical space that collapse supposedly creates, yet it rarely shows how the basic routines of life, governance, production, and survival would actually work. That absence becomes more noticeable the moment the book starts making big assertions about global power and culture. One of the biggest gaps in the book is the total absence of any discussion of political economy. I'm not saying every speculative fiction novel has to be a deep dive into future economic systems, but when you're painting a world 100 years down the line, you would expect at least a little thought about how society actually functions. Instead, the most we get here is a kind of vague acknowledgement that, for example, the humanities department at Thomas's University is underfunded, which implies there's still some money-based system limping along, but that's about it. It's like the author doesn't really want to grapple with how a future society would actually organize itself economically or politically. It's a big void at the center of the world building, and it leaves the whole setting feeling a bit hollow for me. I can hear defenders of this book now saying, well, that's not what it's supposed to be about. Yes, I understand. What I'm saying is, that's the problem. The book wants to talk about how we remember the past, but it doesn't really want to dig into how this future society actually works or doesn't work on a structural level based on a historical understanding of events. And for me, that's a missed opportunity to make the story feel a lot more grounded and real. Early on in the book, the author makes quite a big deal of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which I suspect will date the book. McEwan references the conflict multiple times from the vantage point of 100 years in the future, suggesting the event had long-lasting consequences. The Russo-Ukrainian War, as it's now being called, may well be a hinge point in history. The US is doing a bit of tit-for-tat with Russia as we speak, with the shenanigans going on in Venezuela. So it is fair to say the event is having a cascading effect of sorts. Though again, a passing reference here and there does not constitute a substantial historical analysis. McEwan sets up an opposition that seems tidy at first, but falls apart upon further inspection. Francis is the arch reactionary. He possesses the arrogance of foresight, and of course his foresight is completely wrong. So the quintessential boomer, essentially. Conversely, the narrator offers his perspective from an imaginary future. Thus, he possesses the coveted hindsight liberals pretentiously adopt in present day. That is, the notion that they are on the right side of history, that they will be vindicated by history itself. One of the novel's big future history assertions is that Nigeria, of all places, will eventually become the planet's main center of gravity, culturally and materially, with its infrastructure treated as the new global high watermark of civilization. The claim is meant to signal a genuine shift in the world order. It's one of those details that announces quickly and efficiently that the old hierarchy has collapsed and the reader has entered a world where yesterday's center is now peripheral. McEwan even justifies this in interviews by pointing to Nigeria's demographic scale and cultural energy, implying that once you stop thinking from a Euro-American perspective, Nigerian hegemony is the obvious result. So Nigeria has emerged as the dominant global order, and Nigerian culture is described as increasingly hegemonic, particularly for young people. It's presented as one of the headline indicators that the old Atlantic order has collapsed and a new center of gravity has taken its place. It's the kind of detail in speculative history stories that is meant to make the reader feel as though the ground has shifted under their feet. Yet the claim that Nigeria will become a world hegemonic power in 2119 is off in a major way, because power at that level comes from controlling infrastructure and production, the dull foundations that everyone else depends on. In other words, a nation is able to dominate the world only when it can reliably produce high-value goods at scale, command energy and logistics, pull surplus out of production, and translate that surplus into institutions, research, currency credibility, and hard power. The ugly truth is that there's never been a broadly repeatable path from poor country to rich country that doesn't entail mass industrialization. And if the last few decades are any indication, the trend is in the opposite direction for Nigeria. The country's present-day constraints are myriad: chronic electricity shortfalls and repeated grid failures, heavy reliance on private generators, and the sheer difficulty of keeping power reliable enough for high-end production, alongside stubbornly high poverty rates. A century is a long time, sure, but the novel doesn't even gesture at the kind of transformation that would have to occur for this leap to make sense. I suspect the author did not anticipate a historical materialist to be pedantically picking apart his premise. In truth, the Nigeria thing isn't a problem for me because it's implausible in some realpolitik sense of the world order. I'm perfectly capable of suspending my disbelief. Let's go ahead and assume the global order radically flips by the time 2119 rolls around. Stranger things have definitely happened. The problem is that the claim is load-bearing, and the text treats it like a throwaway flourish. Nigeria is ascendant, Nigerian culture is hegemonic, today's youth are practically marinating in it. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's get back to our moody British academics' interior world. You see where I'm going with this? Without the material backstory that would make Nigerian dominance intelligible, and without any textured sense of Nigerian culture that would make its supposed hegemony feel lived in, the claim reads not so much like a novel remapping of the world and more like a cosmetic reversal that keeps the imaginative center of gravity exactly where it already was, which is to say, a somewhat provincial British perspective. If you're going to assert Nigeria's cultural hegemony, you have to show what's hegemonic. The devil is in the details. What does Nigerian hegemony look like in speech, in taste, in institutional habits, in what people assume is normal, in what they're embarrassed not to know? Hegemony is mundane in an all-encompassing sort of way, and the novel doesn't seem interested in Nigeria as a real historical subject with specific languages, regional tensions, class structures, cultural production, or internal contradictions. All of that stuff is completely ignored. Honestly, you might as well just get a dartboard out and pick a random third world country and say, oh, this country is ascendant now. Isn't that crazy? It's Nigeria as signifier, an exoticized token of Western decline, deployed as a novelty. It's a gimmick, in other words. The real irony is the author is ostensibly skeptical about how we reconstruct the past from fragments, and yet he builds his speculative future using fragments he can't be bothered to properly contextualize. It's a bit maddening when you think about it. Look, if you're going to tell me that Nigeria is culturally ascendant, you have to give me the richness of that world. You can't just name drop it and move on. Historical accuracy notwithstanding, it's just lazy world building. An aside in chapter 20 includes yet another familiar bit of speculative shorthand. A century from now, everyone has blended into a kind of uniform golden brown color, with the few remaining pale white people described as targets of racial prejudice. We are not so sweet or golden after all, the protagonist laments. It's presented as a quick marker of historical change, but it lands like the most exhausted kind of future imagining, the sort of thing a novel tosses out when it wants to gesture at social transformation without actually thinking through how race, class, borders, and power actually reproduce themselves in history. This idea treats race as a simple matter of pigmentation, as if the structure of hierarchy is performed by skin tone alone, rather than by institutions, property relations, migration regimes, policing, and the everyday sorting mechanisms that societies invent in every era. And the idea that white people will soon be a minority is especially banal because it smuggles in a cheap symmetry. It invites the reader to imagine oppression as a reversible costume anyone might wear if demographics were to change, flattening the entire history of racial oppression into a trite thought experiment. Even as a tangent, it's a pretty embarrassing one because it borrows the structure of reactionary paranoia while pretending to be a sober, progressive observation. Additionally, the text does something I am all too familiar with as a YouTuber. It self-consciously tries to head off criticism by inserting blatant caveats, sometimes in the form of exposition, and sometimes by way of a skeptical character, namely Rose. At a certain point, Tom says, "She convinced me that in its infancy the derangement could not have been addressed by fictional realism. It was inadequate to the scale of the problem." Here, Rose functions to undermine the basic underlying notion that literary realism can tackle a subject as tenuous as climate change. It surely can, though of course within the limits of language itself. On that note, Rose is not really a character at all. She's more of a device, the function of which is to undermine the basic premise of the text. Why focus on a lost poem? Why waste time lamenting what has been lost when you have a limited amount of time on this planet? Why would an academic contrive mundane details as though he's crafting a literary work? Why fall in love with a woman from the past when you have a perfectly good one right in front of you? All reasonable concerns, but that's all Rose is, really. A series of skeptical gestures designed to address the absurdity of the premise. This is especially frustrating considering the text's apparent concern with the marginalization of women in relation to the male creative genius in the form of Vivian and Francis Blundy's relationship. What is even more frustrating is at the end of part 1, Rose reveals she's pregnant, and that moment is clearly doing structural work. It signals to the reader that despite the strain and emotional drift we've been observing this whole time, Tom's relationship with Rose is going to be okay. It's their happily ever after moment. It functions as a narrative stamp of continuity, a way of saying the story isn't just about Tom's inward spiral and academic fixation, it's also about a couple who will, in some form, persist and bring new life into this world. The problem is what that signal implies. Instead of the relationship's future being grounded in anything like renewed intimacy, real confrontation, or a changed way of living together, the book uses pregnancy as the shorthand for resolution and permanence. That's a familiar move in realist fiction, but it's especially jarring in a novel that wants to be attentive to history, institutions, and the long grind of various oppressive norms. It subtly turns Rose's body into the medium through which the relationship is redeemed or stabilized. Whatever her role has been as the pragmatic counterweight to Tom, the final beat of this section risks collapsing her into a mere biological function that reassures the reader the lineage continues, therefore the bond continues. We are essentially reassured in the promise of the future. The relationship is granted a future in the most literal possible sense, and that literalization matters because it substitutes biological continuity for the much harder question the novel has been circling. What exactly sustains a bond when the present is hollowed out by obsession, distraction, and emotional negligence? Beyond this, the novel never really addresses what gender dynamics are like a century in the future, and so this narrative move seems oddly conservative to me. Catastrophe has supposedly rearranged the planet, yet the emotional grammar remains stubbornly traditional. The couple is in peril, they work through their issues, and then the pregnancy arrives as a kind of relational anchor. If the book's larger project is to ask what endures and what changes across historical rupture, this is a moment where it reaches for an inherited script about gender rather than showing us a future that has actually developed new ways of imagining commitment, repair, and continuity. All of these problems connect directly to the novel's central weakness, the absence of a believable account of how society really functions in 2119. The narrative gestures towards a world reorganized by catastrophe, yet many of its institutions feel like contemporary institutions that simply survived long enough to continue providing a familiar setting for an introspective academic plot. As previously noted, the university exists, the humanities department exists at this university. That department is underfunded, and to be sure, students are still attending class, colleagues are still bickering, careers are still being fought for and preserved, etc. That all could be true in a future world, but in this novel, it reads less like a considered social arrangement and more like a convenient assumption that keeps the story in a recognizable, safely familiar lane for increasingly inattentive readers. The book circles these structural questions. Who has power? How do institutions survive? What do people do for work? What does the state look like? How is life organized? And then repeatedly retreats into mood and metaphor. The result for those attentive readers among us who still care about such things is a somewhat hollow feeling. A society decimated by climate change would have a different rhythm, different pressures, different ways of organizing survival, different forms of coercion, different cultural habits, etc. The novel occasionally hints at this and then retreats back into the comfort of a setting designed to keep the philosophical meditation legible. Really, the problem with any attempt to depict the future in fiction is the simple fact that reality is often far more bizarre than our imagination is able to apprehend. At this stage in history, the contemplative climate change novel, or rather if we're looking at things more broadly, the dystopian genre in general is almost doomed to fail by design. Our present state is already a boring dystopia. While it is somewhat futile to make such predictions, I expect the future will be simultaneously far stranger than this author anticipates, and yet somehow far more banal at the same time. In Greg Araki's stoner comedy Smiley Face, Jane, played by Anna Faris, is a sweet but hopelessly scatterbrained actress trying to make her way in sunny Los Angeles, California. Toward the beginning of the film, she accidentally eats her roommate's ultra-strong marijuana-spiked cupcakes, setting her off on a day-long, picaresque, paranoia-inducing odyssey. While she's spectacularly high, she tries to juggle a number of relatively basic responsibilities: an audition, paying the electricity bill, paying back her dealer, replacing the cupcakes she ate, etc. Yet every simple errand mutates into a surreal chain of misunderstandings, bad timing, and escalating consequences. Later in the film, Jane's behavior gradually shifts from ordinary irresponsibility into outright criminal behavior when she flees to the home of her former Marxian economics professor. He isn't there, but the professor's mom assumes that Jane is his trusted TA and subsequently gives her a rare first edition copy of the Communist Manifesto to deliver to his office. In Jane's desperate, chemically scrambled state, she perceives the priceless political artifact as the potential solution to all her problems. She finds herself at a meatpacking facility in El Monte. Still clutching the book and barely tethered to reality, she adopts a workerist persona and declares she's there to unionize laborers. She launches into what she experiences as a fiery speech about exploitation and labor rights, in which she quotes the manifesto directly. The film undercuts the moment with a quick reality check. This speech is mostly incoherent stoner babble, and she's promptly thrown out on her ass. The manifesto thread reaches its climax at Venice Beach, where Jane ends up on a Ferris wheel. Get it? Anna Faris on a Ferris wheel, and tries to signal the people she's managed to evade this whole time. In the commotion, the book slips, tears, and its pages scatter into the air over the boardwalk, reducing her one valuable bargaining chip into windblown confetti and cementing the sequence's punchline. The grand revolutionary text is literally ripped apart by accident. Now, you might be asking at this point why I'm talking about a stoner comedy from the mid-2000s in my review of this book. The reason is simple. Believe it or not, the film essentially accomplishes the same thing as this book, more or less, and it does so in a considerably more engaging manner. In fact, it's more effective than the book precisely because Araki apprehends both the immediate everyday struggle of the increasingly lumpenized worker, as well as the contradictions that can play out over the grand scope of history. Araki doesn't rely on played-out dystopian notions about the future that are, in reality, mere projections of present-day neuroses. Instead, he explores the visceral sensation of post-industrial America in all its mundane eccentricities through the stoner comedy genre, which is itself a product of post-industrial America, rendering the whole film a kind of imminent critique. The dystopian genre could serve a similar purpose today, but it would absolutely require a similar kind of imminent unpacking of the genre itself. The thing about Smiley Face is, in a sense, the protagonist, Jane, is ungovernable, not because she's inherently rebellious. Rather, she is simply not capable of functioning in capitalist society. As a result, she seems to unwittingly create utter chaos wherever she goes. Thus, the system is upended not, as we've sometimes seen in prior epochs of history, through the organized activity of an underclass. Rather, it collapses precisely because the psyche of the worker has become so fragmented and disorganized, they're no longer capable of working and have consequently annihilated the class itself. In the words of Marx, history repeats itself first as tragedy and then as farce. The worker is not organized, instead, she's dysfunctional and not even a worker, really. We get hints of this kind of thematic motif in What We Can Know whenever Tom and Rose's students are described. These descriptions mostly read as snapshots of contemporary anxieties. Students who are basically subliterate, indifferent to history, oddly disengaged, and generally positioned as further evidence of the humanity's slow institutional death. A society can't learn from history when the historical subject can't read, doesn't have time to read, and doesn't believe reading will change anything. all valid concerns. The problem is, if you were to project those worries forward 100 years into the future, you wouldn't get the same problems exactly. Once the contradictions actually play out, what you would get is not so much a hyperbolic version of our current intellectual malaise, but rather a qualitative break at some point. If current trends simply continue, the humanities do not limp along forever in a slightly worse version of today's conditions. They get replaced, privatized into niche training, folded into other disciplines, transformed into something unrecognizable, or eliminated entirely because the institutions that support them can no longer justify their existence. A future where the humanities persist could also happen, but it would likely require a major cultural reversal, a society deciding under pressure that interpretive and historical knowledge matters again in a deeply practical way. Either outcome would produce a different institutional reality than just a slightly degraded version of the present status quo. Talking about such a breaking point is difficult because it's a kind of conceptual singularity. Light cannot escape the surface. It's an unknown unknown, as the great philosopher Dick Cheney would say. If I had to put it succinctly, the real problem with what we can know is the book so desperately wants the future to remain legible to contemporary readers, and so it is summarily cloaked in the language of today's shallow campus politics. That's exactly why it feels safe, familiar, and faintly inert even when the text is ostensibly about societal collapse. All too often, the work refuses to depict the future as something genuinely strange. This is how speculative fiction becomes a funhouse mirror for the present rather than an imaginative engagement with both the past and the future. The irony is that the book's best material is about the unavoidable human tendency to invent coherence when faced with historical fragments. Tom's obsession with the lost poem is, in itself, a decent metaphor for what historical reconstruction always risks becoming. The past is never fully present, the record is impartial, interpretation fills the gaps, and ideology distorts the reconstruction. Tom, as a character, embodies that whole problem. He wants the missing object to settle uncertainty, and he uses that uncertainty to justify endless interpretation. As I alluded to previously, it's an elaborate form of avoidance. Rose's skepticism is the novel's internal critique of its own method. The book knows, at least at the character level, that people manufacture the past in their own image and then call that result knowledge. What's missing is a satisfying payoff to the question the book seems most interested in asking. History becomes, in the novel's framing, a disparate assemblage of fragments that humans cohere into comforting narratives, stories that flatter us or soothe our anxieties about meaninglessness and the inevitability of death. The characters cling to these narratives with a kind of desperation, and the text lingers lovingly on the melancholy of that clinging. The philosophical endpoint, though, often feels like a shrug dressed up in literary polish. The book poses the question, what use is history? Gestures at the familiar answer to avoid repeating mistakes, and then implies the fact that we keep repeating these mistakes makes that answer naive. This is not an untrue observation, but it's also not much of a conclusion. A book that wants to interrogate the function of history really does owe the reader more than a tasteful sigh. This is where comparisons to more demanding speculative novels become illuminating, even when the comparisons are unfair. A sprawling novel like Infinite Jest earns its place in the cultural conversation, in part because it treats the reader's attention as a battlefield. It demands sustained concentration in an age designed to fragment it. It also turns its future into a method, a way of making present-day trends visible by pushing them into grotesque clarity, without relying on the comfort of familiar institutional norms. The book asks something of the reader, and that demand becomes part of the argument. What we can know reads smoothly. It is not especially difficult. That accessibility isn't a flaw on its own. It becomes a flaw when the themes it gestures toward, collapse, historical discontinuity, the limits of knowledge, the fragility of interpretation, call for sharper pressure than the book is really willing to apply. The result can feel like navel-gazing. elegant reflection that doesn't really risk confrontation with the very structural questions it keeps circling. And while the author is talking about an extremely dark vision of the future, I somehow still sense a basic level of naivete, and it leads me to feel adrift. That said, the book is not a total failure. The dual timeline is competent, the social dynamics between Thomas and Rose, and Francis and Vivian respectively, have a recognizable emotional logic. The lost poem device is a clever hook, and the way the novel frames cultural memory as a blend of evidence and invention is genuinely interesting. The book has moments where the relationship between personal life and historical narrative feels vivid. It understands that obsession with the past can function as a kind of moral dodge, a way of avoiding responsibility to the present. It also understands that art becomes history through accidents, distortions, and myth-making more than through any stable process of recognizing the truth. The issue is that the novel keeps choosing safety when its own premise calls for risk. It wants the future to feel collapsed but familiar. It wants Nigeria to signal global transformation, but refuses to make the reader inhabit a culturally transformed world. It wants a shattered society, but keeps recognizable institutions intact because they are convenient stages for the book's actual interest, a relatively comfortable, introspective academic inquiry. It wants to critique historical reconstruction while doing a version of it itself, building a future from fragments of contemporary anxiety and letting the readers supply the rest. And that ultimately is why the book can feel faintly inert even when it's describing a dramatically altered world. The collapse is merely atmospheric. The historical break remains more rhetorical than material. The future becomes legible precisely because it has been domesticated, translated into contemporary terms, and rendered safe enough to host a familiar kind of literary melancholy. The result reads less like the world a century from now and more like the present preserved in amber with some floodwater lapping at the edges. For readers who want a polished meditation on memory, loss, and the seductive pull of the past, that may be enough. For readers who want speculative fiction to grapple with the way history actually breaks forms, reorganizes life, and produces social realities that cannot be neatly narrated in today's language, the book's restraint will feel like avoidance. The irony is that the novel understands this problem, Thomas's obsession dramatizes it, and then the novel declines to push its own insight far enough to escape the gravity of its own familiar lens.